Welcome to SR Studios Inside the Issue. Today's guest is Jake Bartman, whose story, At Will, is featured in the fall 2024 issue of Southern Indiana Review. Jake Bartman's fiction has appeared in Story, Ninth Letter, the Minnesota Review, Columbia Journal, Booth, and elsewhere. His story, Night Swim, earned a 2021 Pushcart Prize special mention, and in 2023, he received his MFA from the University of Florida. He lives in New Mexico. Jake, welcome to Inside the Issue.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great. It's great for you to join us. So let's start maybe with you reading a little bit from maybe the beginning of your story, At Will.
Sure. Yes, I'm going to read the first section of At Will. It's about a page and a half long. And so this is the beginning of the story. Marty first fired me on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. A flight had just arrived at Portland International Airport from somewhere, Atlanta or DFW probably, so the flying bean was busy. Marty was on the register handling a line that snaked all through the cafe while I worked the espresso machine, cranking out lattes and Americanos as fast as my hands would allow. The air smelled of coffee grounds and steamed milk, and the espresso machine, an old chrome La Marzocco with wine crusts embossed on either side, groaned and wheezed as it forced hot water through the group heads. We were almost through the rush when a red-faced businessman in khakis and a navy blazer started to shout about the fact that stevia was our only artificial sweetener. He had looked at the silver tag pinned on the front of my flying bean shirt, and he was using my name. "Where's the Splenda, Sierra?" he was saying, waving a handful of blue stevia packets in my face. "Sierra, I want Splenda." "Sir," I said in my most soothing tone, the kind you'd use to coax a house cat from behind a rose bush. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but if you'd please lower your voice." "Is there a problem here?" Marty said from the register. "Where's the manager? I want to talk to the manager," the man said. He had thinning blonde hair, and his face was so red that even his hair seemed to take on a strawberry hue. "That's me," Marty said. "I'm the manager." The man eyed Marty with skepticism. Marty had curly brown hair and round, pockmarked cheeks that gave him a boyish appearance. He didn't look like an authority figure. Still, the man restarted his diatribe, declaring the inferiority of stevia to Splenda and demanding to know what kind of coffee shop we were, whether we cared at all about our customers' health. Marty nodded thoughtfully as the man spoke, radiating sympathy. When the man petered off, Marty turned to me and said coldly, "I thought we talked about this, Sierra. I told you to make sure we were stocked on Splenda. Did you forget to check?" For a moment, I didn't understand. Marty knew as well as I did that we didn't stock Splenda. Then I caught something in his expression. There was the slightest twist to his mouth, and his eyes seemed especially blue. "Yes, sir, you did," I said. I'd never in my life addressed Marty as sir. "Only I thought—" "I don't want to hear it," Marty cut in. "We've talked 100 times about keeping the cafe stocked. I can't have an employee who won't follow directions. Give me your apron and get out." The strawberry man gaped at us. "But Marty," I said. I was warming up now, seeing what Marty was doing. "But Marty, what about my mother? My mother who has cancer, who needs expensive radiological treatments twice a week?" This wasn't true. I'd spoken to my mother just the day before. She was in Boise, waiting for my father to finish his most recent alcohol treatment program. As far as I knew, she was perfectly healthy. "I've given you plenty of chances, Sierra," Marty said in the same cool tone. It gave me an unexpected thrill to hear him use my name when he addressed me. "Are you going to hand over your apron, or do I need to call security?" Now our customer was waving his hands at us. The color seemed to be draining from his cheeks, white spreading from broad nose to fatty cheekbones. "Whoa, whoa, hey now," he said, in a way that made it clear he was used to being listened to. "It's not that big a deal. I don't think that's necessary." "Sir, I'm sorry that your experience at the Flying Bean hasn't lived up to expectations," Marty said. "Can I offer you a complimentary biscotti?" Excuse me. "Really, it's fine," the customer said. "No one needs to get fired over this." "My mother," I wailed. "She's dying." My voice cracked a little. I shucked off my brown apron and threw it onto the bar's marble countertop. "Fuck you, Marty." I stalked down the line and into the back room, and there I waited, peering around the corner to where Marty was slipping an almond biscotti into a white pastry bag, smiling brightly as he passed it to our customer. The man's mouth looked small in his pale face. I waited until the customer had gone. Then I returned to the bar, slipped into my apron, and continued making drinks. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched Marty, noticing how straight he stood. When he caught me looking at him, I turned back to what I was doing, but I couldn't help the slight blush that reddened my cheeks. And that's the end of the first section.
Yeah, thanks. It's such a great opening. I remember reading it the first time, and I was, it's an opening that I think we're all hoping for in a story that makes us want to keep reading. Like it's just even that first line, Marty first fired me on a rainy Tuesday morning. Like, oh, okay, there's something, like I'm immediately intrigued. And it's funny too, the the guy referring to her by name. It's such a like we've seen that guy before, right? Like, where's the Splenda, Sierra? Uh, so can you tell us a little bit about the story's genesis, where it came from or what its inspiration was, anything like that.
Sure. And actually, just to comment on one thing that you mentioned, the his referring to her by name actually emerged in revision because I'd had him just addressing the narrator directly. And one concern that had been pointed out to me in workshop is that oftentimes, if you don't give the gender of the narrator at the beginning of the story, people are going to assume that it's that the narrator has the same gender identity as you do. And so I introduced the name as this way to sort of address that, so that people would know right away what the narrator's gender was. And then that ended up being sort of productive in the way that these things sometimes are, because I think it did sort of play into what kind of character, as you mentioned, this guy is.
Yeah,
So,
I talk to my students about that all the time about how it's not a good thing, but readers assume usually straight white maleness as the
mm,
default, and that's terrible,
mm,
of course. But like it does serve that extra function of like, okay, grounding us, orienting us as readers where we are. I think that's
mm,
great that it serves for sort of something for comic relief and for the characterization and to solve this sort of very practical
mhm.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and in terms of the excuse me, in terms of the story sort of starting with this opening, I think what had happened for me was Uh, so I think the story came to me because I was working in food service, as I did for some time, as many writers do, and I learned that in food service you have to sort of acquiesce to these difficult customers, and a lot of times you have these customers who just get all worked up. You do some minor thing wrong, and they just totally lose it. But it's your job to sort of take it and just accept the kind of abuse that you're getting from people who are pissed off about these stupid things. And so I think that the story, I don't remember the exact moment, but I think the story probably came out of that experience and having, dealing with some unpleasant customer and talking with one of my coworkers after and saying, what do these people want from us? Like, what are they expecting when they come and just chew us out about, having the wrong sweetener or whatever? What are we supposed to do other than say sorry? And so I think that at some point, as I was sort of mulling that over, the idea came to me of like, well, what if you take what they seem to be implying that they want to kind of the extreme, and rather than resisting them, you acquiesce to such a degree that it becomes problematic for them. So that's where this idea of this kind of performative firing came from, I think, as a way to kind of try and one up these, aggressive customers. So that was the initial genesis.
Well,
Yeah.
it's cool too that you've set it in an airport where, you know, everybody's a little bit more frazzled. Like you know, you're not just like, on your way to work, you're on your way to catch a flight that will leave without you. So it ramps up the I don't know, maybe the ugliness of people, perhaps, that it just puts that much more pressure. I think it's a really smart move to place it. Plus, it's such a transitory space where everybody's there's a line I think in the story like I think Sierra says to Marty like you're never going to see that guy again, so who cares, or
Mhm.
something along those lines. And I think that's just a really smart to place it, not just in a coffee shop but in a coffee shop in an airport. uh
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I'm trying to remember now if the airport setting came with the beginning of the story or not. But I think that it ended up working out. It serves sort of a causal function, just because, like you said, you're not going to see these customers again, so you can get away with behavior that you wouldn't if, you had regulars or people who are coming back and that kind of thing. And so I think that that was partly related to the decision to set it in the airport. And then I think also part of this is that this is the Portland International Airport. I lived in Portland for a number of years. And I think I moved there in 2011, which according to Portlandia was like right at the end of old Portland. Or sorry, according to the Willamette Week, old Portland ended when Portlandia came out. And so it was like the tail end of like old Portland because Portlandia came out that year, and Portland became this kind of cultural thing where everybody was moving to Portland. And I had a number of friends who were from Portland, and they were really watching the city sort of become this kind of like, hipster kind of mecca or whatever. And then all this sort of transients and the tourism was really increasing a lot. And it seemed to me that, a lot of the people who were from Portland were sort of dealing with this new sort of status of the city in this way. And so I think that part of what I was interested in writing the story too had to do with someone who's from Portland and sort of dealing with this sort of tourism economy and how it's affecting
Yeah, is there's a line somewhere, there's a line somewhere too where doesn't another customer mention like their Portland experience or expected to
Yeah,
be in Portland or something?
that's right. I think at the very end, there's the customer who's upset and he's got the kind of suspenders and, probably shaved
Yeah,
at the
yeah,
same
yeah.
time. And
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
there to experience Portland and the Portland coffee scene and is disappointed by the coffee experience.
At an airport coffee shop too.
Right, exactly, right.
That's the mecca of great coffee is airports. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the airport thing kind of played into that, the sort of transience, and then also how that relates to Portland in general and the city of Portland, but then also the Portland airport is this kind of iconic now institution. And I think I mentioned that it has this famous carpet that's mentioned at some point, that when they pulled it out, it was very controversial. So,
Well,
so that was part.
what was the carpet that was famous? I've never been there.
It's this kind of it was this kind of teal backdrop with this sort of abstract pattern on it. It's not
Hmm.
like an especially attract. I think maybe because it's slightly unattractive, it became sort of iconic, and so
Huh.
anyway, I think they've so then they were selling pieces of it when they pulled it out. I don't know that the
Wow.
whole
Okay.
story of it, but
Uh,
anyway, yeah.
so what was your process like for this story? And if it was typical for you, like so you could talk about your process, what your typical process is, and if this story kind of fell in line with your typical process, or was there something different about crafting and writing this story?
Yeah, so this one was so usually the way that a story starts for me is with some sense of like a situation and some kind of conflict. And actually, so the story started with this idea of taking these angry customers, I don't know, impulses to this extreme. But when the first draft of the story, it was actually two dudes who were like friends and working in this coffee shop. And I wrote this draft, but the problem was that I couldn't find a way to kind of continue to escalate their relationship in the context of the story. Um, and I'd previously written a story that had a lot to do with sort of friendship between these two guys. And so I wanted to do something that was a little bit different, but I think I worked the story through about, five drafts. And I'm very much like, what I do is I write a draft of a story, usually entirely in one go. And then I just literally write it over and over again. I'll put it on one side of the screen and then open another document and just start writing it. And then, that's the way that I tend to try and work through.
So like you'll literally retype the entire story.
Yeah, totally. Um,
I had
and
my
okay, go
my
ahead.
my um dissertation chair at Nebraska did that, but she was a novelist, and I thought she was nuts.
Yeah.
Just like she would draft a novel and like she's pretty old, so I think she's more old school, would set it aside and just start over. And I'm like, oh my, that I mean, I couldn't even do what you're doing. The story that's amazing to me to literally rewrite, not just the kind of the way we use rewrite to mean like revise, moving.
Mhm.
That's actually really cool. How do you like not just why do you do that, but what does it do for you?
Yeah, so I think, well, where I sort of got that idea from actually was at some point I'd been reading, years ago, I'd been reading Raymond Carver and, talking about Raymond Carver's process and that he would put stories through 15 to 20 drafts. And I had this little epiphany moment where I realized, oh, in the old days before computers, what putting something through a draft meant was that you wrote it up on a typewriter and then you annotated it by hand and then you literally sat down at your typewriter again and rewrote it with incorporating the changes. And so I started trying to do that. And I think what it does for me is it just forces me to pay attention in a way that I don't if I'm just reading and tweaking. And usually when I get, further into the story, once it's been through a number of drafts, then I will just read and adjust and edit and stuff. But for me, really trying to engage with a story on like a structural level, forcing myself to rewrite it, makes me pay attention to like where I'm getting bored or where I'm confused and just really trying to pay attention to the sentences more closely, I think. So that's always been, and then sometimes I'll do it in different ways. Sometimes I'll try and, rewrite like the entire story in one day, just a very quick rewrite, just to force myself through it, and doing it at different paces and stuff like that. I think really, yeah, just forces my attention in a different way than working at it otherwise. So did you find it productive or have you tried that?
I've been too afraid to try it. No, that actually sounds.
Yeah.
I don't think I could ever do it with anything long. But that's actually thinking back to the kind of old school way of doing things, and maybe I mean, it clearly worked. The thing that my advisor said was the way she thought of it was she wouldn't look at it. She would like set it aside and rewrite the
Mhm.
thing like from memory. And I can't even fathom doing that. But she talked about it in terms of like, well, if I forget something in a scene, it must not have been important.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And I don't know how much she was in a position to tell us whatever she wanted to tell us, but there was something to right, where it's like, if you can't recall the description or the moment or whatever, that it might not be necessary.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I think your way is probably a little more efficient. I think to think of it in terms of, the focusing on that really macro level or micro level.
Yeah, and I think Lauren Groff does this too. I've heard that she writes the first draft of a novel and then she just, doesn't look at it again and just does the second draft. And I can understand the appeal of that because I think that one thing that tends to happen to me when I am rewriting things is sometimes stuff that I just like, I will rewrite because it sounds good, and it takes me longer sometimes to realize that something isn't working. I think because I'm just working from, literally an earlier draft. And so
Mhm.
sort of what happened with this story is that I think I put it through like 5 drafts and I just couldn't get the story to escalate in the way that I felt like it needed to be escalating. And I just shelved it for like a year or so, I think. And that is sometimes something that happens to me in the process of writing a story is I get to a point where I just can't think my way through it anymore. And what tends to happen to me is I get so caught up on these issues that I think are issues, but they're not really issues. And then once I get some distance from it, then I come back and I'm able to see what some of the larger problems are there. So that's what sort of happened with this story, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the distance. We get in such a hurry, right? And it's like, no,
Mhm.
like, there's a George Saunders quote. It's much better than what I'm going to say, but he basically says like, you know, how long would you take to write something that might last forever?
Mhm. Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
of course, we have deadlines and all that kind of stuff, but it's about writing you want to try to write a great story, and
Totally.
however long that takes is however long it takes. Now, I mean, it's a privileged position to be in, but I don't know, there's something to that. I think that really strikes me that like, no, I don't need to rush this. It needs to be the best it can possibly be whenever that time is.
Mhm.
I guess so long as we're not using that as a crutch not to write, I guess. Um,
Yeah, totally.
um,
I think
so
that
so oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say that I think that this is something also that workshops have been really helpful for me in is that they're a way of accelerating the kind of distance getting process sometimes, because a lot of times I have the same experience in workshop that I get from taking a long time away from a story, which is people are able to focus on the things that are actually the problems and disregard the things that I'm all hung up on. And so that's been so I think that doing workshops over time has made me a little bit better able to recognize my tendency to fixate on these things that aren't issues and has maybe reduced the amount of time in some cases that I need to take away from things.
Sure.
But other times there's just no way around just having to take a year or so away,
Yeah.
or more or
You're
less.
you're recently out of your MFA, right? Last year.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
How are
2023.
you how are you finding that distance from workshop and deadlines and
I'm pretty good about getting some work done every morning, but and so it's actually been good for me because maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I've been working on this novel project. And I think that, with my first drafting process, a lot of times what I need to do is just get in there and just, flail around for a long enough time that I feel like I'm able to get a sense of like what my sense of is important to a story. And with a novel, I feel like that just takes so long to do that it's kind of nice not to have the deadlines to sort of force me to like get the story ready for other people to read before I feel like I've got a sense of like what kind of the fundamentals are. So far it's been good. I think there will come a point where I will miss having the interaction and, people to give me feedback on it, more directly in the way that you do in workshop. But for right now, being in kind of a very long first drafty phase, it's been okay. Yeah.
good. So so you mentioned that early draft, the early version of this was two men, and the story as published is Sierra, the narrator, and Marty, the
Mhm.
manager. So and you said you had trouble escalating. So what was and you took the time away. What was the thing that sort of made you realize like, that's the way this needs to go?
Yeah, and so I was trying to think about exactly what triggered that for me, and I'm not sure entirely what it was. I think adding adding the kind of romantic element to it seemed to open the story up for me in a way. And this is something, the idea of just like the thing that you need to do in a draft is just find in different drafts is just find a way to keep the story alive is something that I was told at some point. What keeps you engaged in the story in this way that's productive. And a lot of times, a lot of narrators in my stories, I feel like I need to have some slight difference from them. I've never been able to write very well about characters that are too much like me because I think I just get bored. I need to have some slight difference that creates a sort of imaginative space where I need to try and understand something that doesn't seem, I don't know, too directly from my life. And so a lot of times when I'm struggling, I end up changing the gender of narrators around or as kind of a way to approach creating some distance. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. Yeah, but it tends to sort of force me to think about things in different ways. And at some point, I think I was just trying to figure out how to cause this relationship between these two characters in this coffee shop doing this performative firing thing to kind of escalate in some way. And then once I changed the narrator's gender, that created some new avenues for me, I think. Yeah. So I'm not sure if there was a definitive conscious choice, but it just seemed like something to try and sort of see where that got me. And then that ended up introducing these different dynamics that led to me being able to kind of get to the end of the story, whereas before it had sort of petered out, I think. So
No, that makes sense, and it does add. I mean, I'm trying to imagine this as two friends, and it not having this element of a romantic relationship, even though it's not a. I mean, it's a romantic relationship, almost of like a convenience, sort of like it's just kind of like, well, we're both here, and but I can see how that immediately raises the stakes.
Mhm.
And where with the two friends, I could see where that might have if the story had progressed with just the two friends, yeah, it'd be missing the thing that nudges it into sort of more uncomfortable space.
Mhm.
Um,
And it's not like a love story, and I
yeah.
wouldn't describe the story as at all a love story, right? But I think that part of what interested me is the way that the structure of this kind of firing thing, would sort of lend structure to this relationship and how would those two sort of interface with each other. And I think that one thing I realized at some point as I was writing the story is, and George Saunders talks about the idea of a pattern story, that there's this pattern that repeats over the course of a story, and that you can use this to sort of escalate. Uh, and I think that was something that I ended up realizing as I was writing the stories that, oh, this is a pattern story. There's this pattern of firing, and that there has to be some escalation as the story is moving along through that. And that ended up then sort of interfacing with the larger question of the Marty Sierra relationship, and then also with Sierra's own kind of family issues that she has with her father and his alcoholism. So.
Yeah, and what you mentioned about Saunders and pattern, so that's one of the things that I really like. I already mentioned the opening. I was immediately engaged by the opening. Um, and I say I'm a sucker for a good opening, but we all are, I think. Like there's nothing special about that. But good openings, demand our attention, and we are compelled to keep reading, and I felt that with this story. But one of the things, back to this pattern thing, so the story does this really good job of managing my or readers' expectations, because we get, it opens with that first line. Marty first fired me. So we're like, okay, once we get to the end of that first section, we know what that means. And we're like, okay, so this has happened, this is a something they've done multiple times. It's a pattern.
Mhm.
And I think we see it, is it three times, I think. Anyway,
Mhm.
what
Yeah.
so as readers, you've set up this expectation in the story, right? And you manage it throughout, and we know something is going to happen in the realm of like the firing, right? Because you can't, you know, you can't go to like something has to change, right? It can't just be doing it three or four times and have nothing change. So we know it's coming. We know something is coming, right? We know that there's going to be a change in this pattern, and that's something that pulls us through the story, because we're expecting something, and we don't know what it's going to be. So how did you arrive at the final scene where the tables get turned, and um, what's her name? Not Elise, the owner,
Candace.
Candace,
Candace.
where Candace comes in and fires Jake. I'm
Mhm.
not Jake, I'm sorry, fires,
Uh,
comes in and fires Marty.
Marty. Yeah.
Um, so how did you, I mean, was that something that felt obvious to you or organic, or was it something that you were thinking in terms of this pattern and how it had to change?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think so. When I look back at the first draft of the story, it had the coffee shop. It had these two characters who were in this performative firing dynamic. It had Elise as the kind of jaded veteran of the coffee shop, and then Candace was there as the kind of angry owner. And and the story started off very slowly. I think the initial draft of the story really sort of built up to this like firing thing. It sort of showed all this stuff about, here's why working at this coffee shop sucks, and then here's what they're going to do. And then one problem I was having is even once I, sort of started getting traction on the story again after I'd taken some time off, is that the story was just too long. And this tends to be a problem for me. I tend to overwrite things and then have to figure out how to condense and compress. And so that sort of forced me to move this initial firing up to the beginning and just, sort of start in medias res there, which I think is the stronger place to start than, the sort of slower buildup that I'd had initially. Um, and then, having the sense that there was this relationship dynamic and this pattern of this firing gave me the sense that this was building up to something. And then part of the fun of trying to finish the story was figuring out what that something was going to be that would, cause this kind of uh, uh, explosion of some sort, So I think I remember having, as I was working on it again, this sort of, excited feeling of, oh, something's going to happen and I don't know what it is, which is a good place to be in when you're writing a story, to have a sense that this is going somewhere and you don't know what it is yet and you're going to figure it out at the end. And so I think it was just this sort of organic process of thinking about, okay, we have this relationship, and then we have the owner and how are these things going to interface? And then I think what happens at the end is that, there's this performative firing that happens at this really poor time where the cafe is swamped and then Marty strikes Sierra with a rag, and then this is overseen by, or Candace sees this and then uses this as a pretext to fire Marty. And so, yeah, and I'm not sure so it was just sort of an organic thing that the firing kind of came out of that, I think. That, and the irony, obviously, of Marty getting fired after firing our protagonist so many times. I think it just sort
Yeah,
of.
no, it's like the kind of the perfect thing where, we that's what I was talking about. It managed our expectations so well because we know it's coming and yet we don't know the how it's going to happen. So we get that satisfied feeling of, resolution in the sense that the pattern
Mhm.
continues, but it
Yeah.
does in a way that's surprising enough that we don't feel, we're not bored by it. It's just, I think it was handled really well. One last thing I want to say about the story before we talk about, and we've already sort of talked about revision somewhat, but um, it was upon rereading it for, however many times, I noticed something on my page 59. Um, there's a line the narrator says it was a she's talking about this is after her and Marty have spent the night together. He's like sleeping beside her. And she said, I thought about Candace's tumor. So Candace is battling a brain tumor, which may or may not be affecting her mood. It's never really, we're not exactly sure if that's the excuse people give anyway about her being so angry and mean. So I thought about Candace's tumor and wondered who she'd been before. It was strange the way a circumstance could change someone. Yet change in circumstance had never seemed to help my father. And we learn in the story too that Sierra's father is an alcoholic who's been in and out of rehab most of her life. Um, and then it like that struck me as this thematically really it resonated, right? This idea that all of these people are in a particular circumstance. Every single character has, I mean, I guess in a way we're all part of the circumstances we're in, but these characters in particular feel, you know, very much wedded to like their relationship is very much circumstantial. Like these people
Mhm.
would not be friends. I mean, even Marty or Sierra and Marty like knew each other in high school, but they weren't, it's not like they were friends. So
Mhm.
I don't know. There's something about that, and then it comes up at the very end too, after what's clearly a dissolution of Marty and Sierra's relationship. She says, "How could I have ever seen Marty as any other than as the kid I'd known in school? You couldn't
Mhm.
become someone else so easily. People don't work that way." And then she goes on to say, we both seem to understand that without the bean, the coffee shop, to give form to whatever had sprung up between us, there was no reason to carry on. So
Mhm.
was this thing that I'm kind of talking about thematically something that you hit upon early and realize like, this is something I can do? Or is it just one of those happy accidents that happen in stories where they end up being about things that we aren't conscious of?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm inclined to sort of think of it as the happy accident thing. So this is, but I think the stuff about Sierra's father and her father's alcoholism, I don't think had been in the first draft of the story when it was just these two friends. Uh, and this was another thing that sort of emerged again out of, the sort of gender switch thing and then, creating this romantic relationship dynamic. And somehow that pushed me into wondering a little bit more about what's going on in the background for Sierra, and then this led to the stuff about the alcoholism and the repetition of that pattern. So I think maybe on some level, as I was sort of thinking through at some point having this, so this is, I'm interested oftentimes in the ways in which having some awareness of what you're doing at a craft level while you're writing a story can sometimes hinder you, but can sometimes sort of make you aware to sort of thematic things that you're doing. And so I think maybe at a certain point when I realized, oh, this is like a pattern story that I'm doing with this firing thing, that led to these thoughts about, okay, well, what are some of the other sort of patterns that Sierra is seeing and elsewhere in her life, and so then there's this pattern of her father and his alcoholism, and then I think also, that yeah, so I think that there was some sort of semi mostly unconscious connection between the pattern of the firing and the pattern with her father, and then thinking about how uh, yeah, that this is a story sort of governed by the structures. I think something that by the structures of the workplace, the structures of the airport and these dynamics sort of interfacing with these characters. So I tend to be interested in, I think performance is something that I write a lot about and about how characters are performing their identities in these different contexts. And so this obviously in the coffee shop, there's this performance, but where does the performance sort of end and where do you run up against something more deeply entrenched and ingrained? And I think that the inability for Sierra's father to change sort of points to the limits of what performance can do, I think is what I might
No,
think
yeah,
about.
that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, it struck me because it's so subtly weaved through. It struck me as something that you probably weren't as a reader. It didn't strike me as
Mhm.
something that you were conscious of because I think
Mhm.
sometimes I'm sure you've experienced this too, where you read a story and you can kind of tell that the writers sort of hit upon a theme or an idea or started with a theme or idea and it's too much. And this was
Mhm.
something that did not occur to me until the third or fourth time I'd read the story. I'm like, oh yeah, there's this other stuff going on. And that's what good stories do, right? They continue to reveal things to us the more we read them. Or they reward our rereading.
Mhm.
um so can you tell us about any sort of foundational books or writers, for both you as when you first started out writing, or books that you return to, or writers that you return to, whether craft or just their fiction?
Mhm. Yeah, so it's sort of one thing I was thinking about with respect to this story is my my writerly trajectory seems to be that I ping pong back and forth between writing stuff that is like very voicey and sort of formally experimental, and then stuff that is more sort of conventional at the level of voice and in some respect structure. And I think that a lot of my interest in the sort of formally innovative stuff really goes back to the modernists. I was like a huge, I think so like Faulkner, Woolf, and Joyce were like really big for me and were really kind of the writers that when I was uh, first thinking about writing in high school and then in college, reading those writers really sort of exposed me to the idea of the ways in which you can bend language and form to try and tell whatever the story is that you're trying to tell. So the modernists are really, I think, probably who I come back to the most. And so that's not very apparent in this story, because I think the way that I approach things is that I tend to write a very wacky, experimental, formally weird story, and then I feel sort of guilty about that, and then I write a more sort of conventional story, and then I feel like, well, I want to do something wacky now, and so I think that my trajectory as a writer has been trying to figure out how to sort of reconcile those impulses in some ways. But ultimately, it's still kind of the modernists or the writers that I think open things up the most for me. So
That's really cool. I don't know. I'm only teaching undergrads here, but they don't read any modernists, unless maybe they'll read a Faulkner, a famous Faulkner story, barn burning or a Rose for Emily or something like that. But I don't hear any of them talking about even Joyce's short story. I mean, of course, they're not reading Ulysses or anything, but even Joyce's short stories. I take that they probably do read Woolf. They probably read To the Lighthouse. That's a
yeah.
book that I think is still gets read pretty frequently. But yeah, that's really cool. That's not what I would have expected you to say, which is awesome.
Well,
Yeah.
so one thing I was thinking about, and actually, I think it was like the week that I workshopped this in my MFA program, there was this essay that came out by Stephen Marsh, I think is how you pronounce his last name. It was in LitHub, and it was about the literature of the pose. Are you familiar with this essay?
The literature of what?
The pose. And
Oh,
it sort of contrasts the literature of the pose versus the literature of the voice.
hmm.
And it takes Sally Rooney in particular as its focus, and says that Sally Rooney is sort of emblematic of this new mode of literature, which is the literature of the pose. And the literature of the pose is not interested in like linguistic, I guess, innovation. It's interested in sort of formal correctness, and in being willing to uh, and Marsh says that this is sort of arises out of the culture, that the way that the culture has tended away from the literature of the voice, which is these largely male, sort of extremely egotistical male writers who have these very colorful, like think of like Martin Amis or something, these very flamboyant kind of colorful approaches to language, but that are also very uh, very much just limited to the writer's own experience, and that the literature of the voice, the writers are just interested in becoming more and more themselves rather than being interested in the rest of the world, and that the literature of the pose has this kind of broader view of things. And so I think that as a writer, what I've been trying to figure out how to do is to sort of reconcile this kind of impulse toward, language and the literature of the voice with something that isn't quite as, I guess, sort of closed off in the same way, and so focused on the individual writer's kind of tastes and judgments, like Philip Roth or something, but that has a broader view. So,
I missed that essay. I'll have to check that out. That sounds really great. So speaking of other writers, who should we be reading that maybe we aren't, or are there any emerging writers you're interested in, or unsung writers? Or you could just say, who are you reading, but who should we be reading?
yeah, well, so one story I thought of as I was rereading this is, let's see. So when I was first sort of starting to pursue writing more seriously, I was an intern at Tin House magazine, the now defunct Tin House.
Sadly, yeah.
And yeah, and Tin House ran the story by Rita Bullwinkle, who at the time was more up and coming than she is now. But Rita Bullwinkle had the story called Decor, and it's about this woman who works in this like upscale furniture gallery, and is then asked by this convicted murderer to help him furnish this kind of imaginary sort of house. And it's this very dark, sort of unsettling story, but that also has to do with labor. But the story really kind of knocked me out and got me very interested in Rita Bullwinkle. So she had a story or collection called Belly Up, which I really loved. And then she had a novel come out recently, which I also really enjoyed a lot. So I really like Rita Bullwinkle. Recently, I read Vanita Blackburn, who I'd been introduced to because she had a story collection called Black Jesus, which a friend of mine had given to me, and which was great. And then she had this novel come out recently called Dead in Long Beach, California, which is just so formally strange and so unusual, that's been one that I've really been thinking about a lot lately. So those are some of the writers in the last few months that I've really enjoyed. Right now, I'm reading Burnham Wood, the Eleanor Catton book, which is really also sweeping and sort of classically novelistic in some ways, I guess. So those are writers I've been thinking about lately.
I re the Venita Blackburn, her second collection, what was it called?
Ooh,
Something like how to about fight wrestle like a girl or
yeah,
I'm thinking of the right one. I read it.
right.
Yeah, I really like that collection. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um,
He has a way with form that is also like another writer. So in my MFA program, Camille Bordas was on the faculty there, and she also publishes these stories that are just so formally perfect and are so governed by their own kind of necessity, and you never feel the pressure of any kind of outside notion of what the form needs to be. And I think Benita Blackburn really does that, where you feel the form arising from the language in a way that I admire as someone who tends to sometimes overdetermine form, I think. So
all right, cool. So you mentioned earlier that you're working on a novel. Do you want to talk about that at all, or just that you're working on a novel and we can await that?
yeah, maybe I'll let's see, what can I say about the novel? The novel I've been working on for a while now. It's set in the 1970s. It is a kind of it's a social comedy novel. And the focus of the novel is, have you heard of Larry Norman? Are you familiar with Larry Norman?
Not ringing a bell.
So he is generally taken to be the inventor of Christian rock as a genre.
Oh,
He
okay.
had,
All
he
right.
had this success as like this mainstream rock musician, and then had this conversion, and went on to sort of invent Christian rock. And then his career sort of exploded later on because he was accused of infidelity. It was, there were rumors about him, doing drugs and stuff like that. And it was this, and it arose out of the Jesus movement, which was this in the late 60s and early 70s, this sort of utopian Christian movement in Southern California that was like the hippies who became Christians. And then, so the novel's sort of about a cast of characters, sort of, having to do with this fictional Larry Norman, analog. And I think it also is really about how there was this utopian moment in American Christianity before this Christian movement got absorbed into this kind of Christian right. And so sort of trying to understand how things could have gone in a different direction rather than taking this kind of right turn over the course of the 1970s and 1980s, but specifically looking at this cast of characters in the Jesus movement and the kind of music scene. So it's historical, and it's very complex, and it has been making me kind of insane for the last 3 years. It's very broad,
No,
but
that
that's
that's
what.
that actually sounds really cool. That is a very kind of interesting moment to think about how vastly different it turned out than
Mhm,
what it maybe like it could have been or was for a short time.
mhm,
All right, well, very cool. That's
mhm.
I hope it all. I hope you keep working on it. Hope it comes to
Thanks.
fruition for you.
Slowly
Um,
but surely, yeah.
yeah, well, yeah, that's the only way to do it, man. Um, all right, well, great. Thank you very much. You can find Jake's story at will in the fall 2024 issue of SIR. And you can go to usi.edu/SIR to find out how to get a copy. And I'll have the link below in the description. Thank you again, Jake. I appreciate you taking the time and talking with us about your great story.
Great. Thanks so much, Casey. It's been fun.
All right, we'll see everybody on the next one.